Hello, and welcome to this segment on conflict management. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, particularly because most of us have experienced conflict. We're not trained in how to deal with conflict, and for a lot of other reasons here that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about some basic principles with the idea that if we better understand some of the dynamics going on in conflict, we can be better prepared to deal with it when we experience it and hopefully turn a negative situation into a positive one. So one of the things that has helped me is to remember that conflict is natural. It's part of being a human being. And we are going to have differences with others. We are going to experience some level of conflict throughout our life. So our goal isn't to avoid it, nor is it to charge through it, but rather to learn how to work through it in a way that helps us to meet our needs as well as maintain the relationship with the other person and help the other person also meet their needs too, if at all possible. So there are some strategies that we will be looking at here as we go through this session. So I think one of the things that's helpful to think about as we go through this is for you to think about a recent conflict that you experienced with someone and to think about what was it, who was involved, what was the situation, how did you handle it, did you get what you wanted in the end, how did it make you feel? How did the other person feel? Did the other person get what they wanted? Was the relationship enhanced or was it damaged? What was the outcome of it? We all know the negative aspects of conflict, and showing these two men, the one with his finger up, shouting at each other, we know those negative behaviors that come about in conflict. We also know that conflict can spiral to a point where we try to avoid the other person and maybe even move into a state of retaliation, which is a polarized and a very negative state of conflict, and that's what we want to try to manage so that we don't go there. We also know that conflict can increase stress levels. When I do workshops on this, I ask the question, how many of you have experienced a recent conflict? Every hand goes up. I ask about the stress levels, and it's always sky high. So we know these feelings and what it can do for us, and sometimes those sleepless nights that we have. But here's another negative aspect of conflict is that we can end up with negative relationships and neither one of us get what we want. And that's also very negative. But we also have to think about conflict in positive ways. And this maybe sometimes is hard to do, especially as we're experiencing that conflict. But there are many positive aspects of conflict. This is how we discover new information about the issue or maybe even about ourselves. It's how we can bring about positive changes, not only in the community, but in ourselves and our own behavior. It's also where we grow. We don't grow so much from those things that come easily, but we grow when we've been challenged, and it provides some great personal opportunities for growth. We can also enhance our communication as we learn how to work through challenging situations to communicate more effectively, especially with others that are giving us challenges. It can also help build relationships and trust and respect with one another when we handle these difficult situations well. And it can also lead to more satisfying relationships, and in organizations and in communities, more positive community within which to work. So what is conflict? This is a very hard thing to define, and in workshops we spend some time talking about what is conflict and how do you think about it. And it's actually very difficult in the literature to find a good definition. This is one definition that has been used. It is a process. It is a dynamic interaction between two or more people that are interdependent with each other and have some level of difference or incompatibility. So we're going to talk about the different levels of conflict and then what we can do. Before doing that, I'd like for us to think about sort of three aspects of conflict that may help us recognize within ourselves where we go when we are experiencing conflict. And one of those is the cognitive dimension. In other words, what we're thinking. It's our perceptions, it's our assumptions, it's the intentions that we attribute to others. It's what we're thinking. A second aspect is the emotional dimension. It's what we're feeling, the anger, the frustration, the disappointment, the anxiety. The emotional level is different than the cognitive level. And then it's what we do. It's the behavioral dimension. So it's what we say, how we say it, and maybe other forms of physical behavior that we show. So I'm going to talk just a bit about these so that we better understand. By the way, I will say the literature for this comes out of social psychology. So the cognitive dimension is about the culture and the attitudes that we were born with and where we come from. And for each of us, this is a little bit different as we come from different communities and different places. Also, how we view power, both our own power and others. And what I mean by this is sometimes we see ourselves as victims, where we have no power as we interact with others. Or we may see ourselves as very domineering, powering over others. And one of the things that we want to talk about as we get into how to manage conflict is talking about how do we think of power with others, not under others or over others, but with others. Power is a very, very important dimension. And then perceptions, and this is how we make sense of things. So each of us have our own truth, what we believe to be real. And anytime I hear people say, well, that's just the truth of the matter, oh, that's a red flag for me, because that's their truth. And it may be a very narrow truth. So we all believe our perceptions to be real. And if we have our truth and we feel others are wrong, it's very easy to demonize others. So this is a caution in terms of how we think about our own perceptions and assumptions that we make about things. We also tend to attribute motives to others when we in fact don't know motives of others. What motivated? What was another person's intent when they did or said that? We don't know that unless we have communicated with them. The other thing is we tend to remember selectively, and we tend to remember those things that benefit us. So, we're rather selfish sometimes. So let's just kind of keep that in mind as we think about some of this. Challenges that we have with ourselves. The emotional dimension. Emotions to me are just absolutely fascinating. Because I hear so often out in the communities where they're dealing with really controversial issues, those people are just so emotional. If they would just get off their emotions and attend to the facts, we could resolve this issue. Well, okay, folks, come on here. We all have emotions. Emotions play a very, very important role in who we are as human beings. They tell us what's important. And they give us the energy to act. Our emotions motivate us, but they also are the fuel of conflict. And when we have our hot buttons pushed, and all of us have hot buttons, those things that threaten us, those things that internally create a sensation of we're going to fight, Those are the hot buttons, and we need to know what those hot buttons are. And then we need to learn how to control those hot buttons. Moving on to the behavioral dimension, this is what we see and hear. So the behavioral dimensions we know. These are the words we use, the language, the tone of voice, the body language, the actions that we take. This is what we see and hear. But let's just remember all of these other dimensions that's going on in terms of what individuals are thinking, ourselves and others, and feeling are also driving the dynamics of these interactions that we have. So I've put together a little sketch here that links emotions and behaviors. Now, neuroscientists would probably be very upset with this, but in my reading about how this occurs and the research on this, this is how I make sense of it. So this is a simplified interpretation of a very, very complex physical response in the brain, as well as an interaction with another human being. So something happens. There's some triggering event. It may be what somebody has said or something has happened that creates in us our feelings, and these feelings are automatically generated. So it sets us off. So we feel anxious, we feel angry, we feel frustrated. We do not have control over these feelings. It's an automatic response in our body that comes into the back part of our brain, and our body responds. So if we're good at reading body language, we can actually read this in other people. But I want to focus on how we ourselves learn to read our own body language. So in workshops, I talk about when our hot buttons are pushed, how do we know our hot buttons have been pushed? So we might feel our heart flutter, we might feel a little bit queasy, our heart rate goes up a bit, sweaty palms, reading the body language in others, the eye might start to twitch, some people's ears may turn red. Our bodies respond when there's a threat to the body. And if we don't think about those hot buttons and how our body is responding, we try to protect ourselves. So a very reactive response is this. So if we don't become aware of our own hot buttons and how to respond, this is what we may be likely to do when a person is stressed and then their hot button is pushed. And it doesn't have a very positive effect on others. This is what makes people turn away. So reading this body language on this couple here, boy, doesn't that say everything. Turned away from each other, woman looking at the guy like, what the heck is going on here? Arms crossed, closing people out. Body language says everything. So let's look at this again in terms of recognizing our own emotions and what we might do. So that triggering event, something happens, something is said that triggers those emotions within us, and our body is going to respond, those automatic feelings, and they're going to cause us to have the heart flutter, ears turn red, whatever it may be. Crossing our arms in front of us, our body is going to respond. And here's the trick. Now this is very hard to do, but if we start to recognize what our hot buttons are and our responses to those hot buttons, and we think of a switch in our brain that we can turn on and off. Now obviously we cannot do that, but if we can visualize that, and give ourselves just a few seconds to become aware and to cool down and to think about what we say. So it's becoming very intentional. So this is the other wonderful part of our brains. We can learn how to do this. So what do? We take a deep breath. Maybe we take a step or two back away from the person. We're giving ourselves just a few seconds to think, to think before we react. So we think about how we respond. And when we respond, hopefully we respond with a little more thought about an appropriate response. And we think about the words we use, what we say, how we say it before we do. And hopefully then that leads to a more interactive, productive relationship. This is very, very hard to do, but it can be learned, but it starts with awareness and knowing how to control our own emotions. So just a bit about how emotions are connected to our behavior in a very simple schematic. Another way of thinking about conflict is to think about the different dimensions of conflict. And I like to illustrate it with a little tornado. Here in Indiana, since we have a lot of tornadoes, and listening to this time of the year in the spring when we're likely to get them, they start off with just little whiffs of air, and they grow in intensity over time. And so can it be with our differences with others. So differences, we know we have differences. We come from different places. We come from different cultures. We have different values, different political views. Different types of communities, different educations. There's a lot of things that make us different from each other. And hallelujah, it's through these differences that we learn from each other. So differences, for me, is a way that we celebrate and recognize others aren't like me, and I can learn a lot from others. So it tells me I want to learn. I want to listen to others, and I want to look at issues from different points of view. But in those differences often can come misunderstandings. Misunderstandings is when our cognitive skills are making us make assumptions, or we give negative attributes to another person in terms of we think we know what their intentions are. It's where we do our fear-mongering based on our fears, and we just know that other person is doing this to get at us, when in fact they may not even be thinking about you. It was a totally unintentional act. So misunderstandings arise because we don't have clear communication. We haven't interacted with the other individual. So this is a really, really big area, and the area in which we can resolve our misunderstandings, our misperceptions by communicating with the other person. But it takes courage to do that, and it takes honesty of being able to approach the other person and say, you know, I'm not sure I fully understood what you were trying to say to me. And I'm here to listen. Another level is a level of disagreement. And this is where we simply may just disagree about a topic. And that is going to happen. And what do we do with disagreements? Well, several things. We can try to negotiate a resolution where we learn to compromise. Or we can agree to disagree if it really doesn't matter. Or we just have to learn to come to terms with it. Oftentimes in organizations there may be policies that are established, and so we make decisions whether we engage in a conversation about that issue, whether we try to negotiate that issue to get our needs met, or whether we learn to just live with the policy decision. So disagreements are at a little different level. Again, it requires communication and making decisions about where we go with this. A critical point here at which conflict can escalate to a whole nother level. And this is where we have to decide, because we can only control our own thoughts, our own behavior, whether we continue in what is a developing conflict or not. So a higher level is discord. Now you know you are at a higher level when you see a person and you avoid them. you really don't want to interact with that other individual. Conflict is becoming very personal at this stage. This is where emotions start to take hold, and where the issue and the emotions are so intertwined, it's very, very difficult to even identify what the issue is. So remember I said earlier, we deal with high levels of emotion with empathy. We listen, we ask questions, we paraphrase our understanding with another person, but we resolve issues through problem solving or negotiating. We have to know what the issue is in order to problem solve it. At the level of discord, being able to identify the issues to problem solve them is becoming very difficult because of the high level of emotion. And the worst level is the polarization. And this is where people will not even come into the same room together. Polarization is about retaliation. It's about winning. It's about getting even. It's about, I am not even going to sit down and discuss this with you because, by golly, we're going to see each other in court. Or it's a very, very, very nasty stage of conflict, which is very costly, both in time as well as emotions, stress levels, and even financial expense. Because at this level, usually a mediator needs to come in to help resolve the issue if it's an issue that needs to be resolved. So something to keep in mind, these 5 different definitions of conflict, or levels of conflict if you will, as they go over time, emotions rise. And here's the scary part, our reasoning declines. Our reasoning declines. So a source for this I would recommend, I really like this book by Runde and Flanagan of Becoming a Conflict Competent Leader. I think it's anybody that works in leadership should understand these dynamics. And they're quick to say it's not documented that conflict passes through these 5 levels sequentially. It doesn't happen that way. But I put them here as a way to understand there are different ways of thinking about conflict and different strategies about what we can do. So again, celebrating our differences, clarifying our misunderstandings so that we can check our own perceptions and understanding of the issues, and thinking about when we disagree whether we engage to negotiate a resolution or whether we learn to live with it. We have a choice here on where we take conflict, and not to escalate it to those higher levels if at all possible. So how we learn to manage conflict is shaped very early in our life in terms of what we witness by those who raise us. And we may have had good role models, or we may have had very poor role models. It's also influenced by our personality, our values, how we view power, our life situations and experiences, our life history. And an instrument that you can take to show your approach toward conflict is by Thomas Kilmann. You can purchase this online. And in doing a conflict workshop, it may be something you may want to do to help people think about their own personal approach to conflict. And there's 2 dimensions here in terms of thinking about how concerned am I with my own needs, and how concerned am I with other people meeting their needs. And so this gives us 5 approaches to conflict. And as we think about different issues that we approach, whether in our family, in the community, and depending upon what the issue is, when we really don't, it's not a big issue. It's a trivial matter for both parties. We're likely to avoid the issue. Then we may end up resenting. So if avoidance is an approach that we use on every issue, that's not very effective for us. Sometimes we accommodate. I think of this largely in families. It may be really, really important to our spouse or to our children, and so we sort of give in. It's not very important to us. There are other times, however, where the issue is really important to us, particularly around issues that may involve our own integrity or integrity of how we approach an issue where we compete. But here again, if we compete with everything we do, that's not going to be an effective approach because not all situations require a competing approach. Compromising is where we give up something and another person gives up something. In many of the community issues, where we want to reach is a collaborating. And a collaborating approach means generating innovative solutions that really go beyond. So at a community context, compromising is a short term to get through the issue. It usually isn't a long-term solution because people's interests haven't been met. So when issues are really important to one party and really important to another party, collaborating may be the only approach where both parties can get their needs met. So this is a whole video that I'll be doing in another segment, a lot to say about that approach. A thoughtful approach, an effective approach for us to think about as we think about our own engagement in conflict. What are your interests? What are your goals? What is it that you want to have achieved? And how important are they to you? I mediate a lot of conflict situations, and there's a lot of emotion. It's very hard to resolve those conflicts because the only way you can resolve emotional conflicts is with empathy. So unless you have an issue defined, you really can't do any problem solving to resolve the issue. So you have to be able to get to the level where you can identify what are your interests, what do you want to have as outcomes, what are your goals, and the other party has to also know that. Otherwise, it can be just an emotional banter back and forth that escalates a conflict and neither party is clear about what they want. That's not useful. So thinking about the outcomes that you want is one of the early things that needs to be done. And then how much do you care about the interests of the other person and your relationship with him or her? So in a community, in a family, in the workplace, those relationships are usually pretty important to us. If we don't know the person, we don't care about the person, we don't care about the relationship, well, maybe that's a whole nother matter and we go for another approach. But I think in most of the situations where we are working closely with others, we do care and that relationship is important to us. So here's the bottom line. Do you want to have yours and the other person's needs met, or do you want to win? Keep in mind the needs of others and try to put yourself in the shoes of the other party. And you probably won't know what his or her needs are until you talk to them and you listen to them and you hear about their feelings. So working through a conflict situation, I wish it were so easy to say, here's step 1, step 2, step 3. It's not that easy, but I think there is a process that we do go through. And first and foremost, knowing our own hot buttons and working to control our hot buttons and our emotions before we respond. As we talked about in interpersonal communication, what we say and do and how we say and do it is going to cause a response in others, and that can escalate the conflict. Listen to understand the other person before you speak your needs. So listen to the extent of understanding and paraphrasing back to the other person what you've understood them to say. So as you're doing this, ask questions to clarify. Check your own assumptions and misunderstandings before you speak about your thoughts, your feelings. And when you speak, think carefully about the words that you use and know your point, speak honestly, and speak with clarity and simplicity. Identify areas where you do agree. And this is about building a bridge with that other individual. Identify areas where you think we agree on. So as I'm hearing this, it seems to me that we agree on this, this, and this. And then the other person can say, yes, I believe so. And then you can work on those areas where you don't agree. And this is where you brainstorm possible solutions. So in working through conflict, if you look at these, 5 bullet points that I have here, we're starting with those interpersonal communication skills first. We're showing the empathy. We're controlling our own responses to a challenging situation. So we're using those interpersonal skills first. That last bullet point is about resolving the issue. And to resolve the issue, you need to be clear about what are those issues? What is it that you want to have happen? So some communication tips. Deal with conflict face-to-face. Oh, I can't emphasize this enough. I have not found a way to deal with conflict virtually or electronically. On the other hand, I have seen conflict created through email messages, texting, and other forms of electronic communication. I think conflict has to be dealt with face-to-face so that you can see body language and understand intent, both of yourself and of the other person. The body language is just so very, very important. Stay in the present and the future. Don't bring up the past. You can't change the past. It's not useful. There's enough to talk about in the present, and focusing on the bigger picture as we move forward. How do we go about this? And the future gives you a pathway, I think, to resolve conflict. Stick to the topic at hand. Don't bring up other issues that maybe need to be dealt with at another time and place. Keep the focus on the issue at hand. Be honest, be direct. Consider the interests and feelings of the other person. Look for those areas of agreement. And when the discussion starts to escalate, as it may well, particularly if you're dealing with a highly sensitive issue, this is a real skill. Escalating emotions tell us a lot because they can tell us what's important to the other person. And so when our emotions start to escalate, we don't necessarily want to shut it off immediately because that's giving us and them important information. But however, when those emotions start to become personal, when we start to accuse the other person or they of us, then that's moving into a higher level, if you remember the little tornado, and that's when you need to withdraw because our reasoning is dropping off and we're not resolving the conflict, we're just making each other madder. So learn how to work with emotions. Don't be too quick to withdraw, but knowing that line. And if you do withdraw, schedule another time to talk. So saying something like, our emotions seem to be getting the better of us right now. Why don't we think about this a little bit and think about some of the things we talked about, and let's come back together tomorrow or at another time when we're a little more refreshed. So in summary, conflict is a part of our lives, and it's important to learn how to use our interpersonal communication skills first to work through difficult situations and then work on problem solving those issues. Conflict can take us to new places and to innovation that we may never even have dreamed possible. As we interact with others in these conflict situations, however, we need to have the patience to work through it. Conflict is dynamic. It's going to escalate and de-escalate over time. There are 5 approaches that we talked about. Each of those approaches are appropriate in different situations. But collaborating is what enables both you and the other person to meet your needs and maintain a relationship. It's an ideal to work toward, but it's not possible in all situations where issues have become so polarized that only a mediator is going to be able to intervene. Effective communication skills are essential. So let me come back on the screen here for a moment and say these are some of the resources that I used in the research a lot in social psychology, which is the area that my degree comes from. I've always loved understanding what makes us tick as people, particularly as we interact with others and as we interact in a community context. A lot to learn, a lot to grow from, and a lot to just keep working on as we work on those important issues in the community. Thank you very much, and I hope you join me in one of these other segments.